Imagine the smell. But not the kind of smell we're used to today. Imagine a sweet, sickly stench of rotting garbage, human sweat, cheap ale, and open sewers flowing right down the middle of the street, all suffocated beneath a thick blanket of coal smoke. That was the scent of London in the spring of 1665. It was a massive, deafening, half-million-strong hive of humanity, the commercial beating heart of the world that never slept. People were crammed into narrow, muddy alleyways where the timber-framed houses leaned so far forward that neighbors on the top floors could literally reach out and shake hands across the street. Amidst this deafening noise and filth, no one paid any attention to the merchant ships that docked at the Thames in late 1664, arriving straight from Amsterdam. No one noticed the stowaways slipping down the thick mooring ropes under the cover of the dense London fog. Black rats. But truth be told, the rats themselves weren't the real problem. The true microscopic murderer was hiding deep within their fur. The rat flea. An insect barely 3 millimeters long carrying a deadly payload in its gut, a bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. To the people of London, this tiny, insignificant insect was about to become the harbinger of the apocalypse. But for now, nobody knew a thing. The citizens went about their daily lives, enjoying the approaching spring, blissfully unaware that beneath their floorboards, in their cellars, and among their firewood, a biological time bomb was ticking. A bomb that in just a few short months would turn their bustling metropolis into the largest graveyard in English history. Chapter 1: First Blood and the Anatomy of a Nightmare. It started quietly, far away from the gilded halls of the royal palaces. It began in the poorest, filthiest parish situated just outside the city walls, St. Giles in the Fields. That is where in April the first isolated deaths began to be recorded. How did the authorities of London react? Exactly how authorities usually react. They shrugged it off. It was just another fever among the poor. After all, in a city of this size, someone was always dying. But then came the summer. May and June of 1665 went down in history as some of the hottest, most stifling months the oldest Londoners could remember. The air was dead, heavy, and practically boiling. For the fleas carrying the bacteria, these conditions were absolute luxury. They began to multiply at a terrifying rate. As the infected rats started dying off from the plague themselves, the fleas, driven by a desperate, ravenous hunger, began searching for a new host. And they found one: sleeping humans. Just one bite, a tiny, itchy prick on the skin. That was all it took to release the bacteria into the human bloodstream. What happened to the human body next was a living horror, a horror against which 17th century medicine was utterly and tragically helpless. Picture this process. A person wakes up with mild chills and a headache. They think it's just a common cold, perhaps fatigue from the brutal summer heat. But within hours, their body temperature violently spikes, excruciating vomiting and violent convulsions follow. And then, the true nightmare begins. The bacteria travels to the lymph nodes, most commonly in the groin, the armpits, or the neck. The nodes begin to swell, growing to the size of an apple or sometimes even an orange. These horrific tumors, called buboes, which gave the bubonic plague its name, became rock hard, turning a sickening shade of purple and black, filled with rotting blood and pus. The pain they caused was absolute, mind-shattering, that patients would throw themselves across their beds screaming in agony. Some, in an act of sheer, blinding desperation, would beg their families to slice the tumors open or try to cut them out themselves, falsely believing that draining the black sludge would bring them relief. It didn't. Worse still, if the bacteria reached the lungs, it mutated into pneumonic plague. The victim would begin to cough up blood. From that exact second, every breath they took, every cough sprayed invisible death onto anyone standing in the room. Death was brutal, and it was fast. It often claimed its victims in just 2 or 3 days after that first flea bite. In the final stages, dark spots would erupt across the victim's skin, subcutaneous hemorrhages that the panicked public called the tokens of death. When a doctor saw these tokens scattered across a patient's chest, they knew the fight was over. It was a death sentence. The patient had hours left at best. By June 1665, these tokens of death began to appear on the bodies of hundreds and then thousands of Londoners. The church bells in St. Giles began to toll without pause, ringing from dawn until dusk. The hushed rumors, which nobody had wanted to believe just weeks prior, solidified into a blood-chilling certainty. This wasn't just a summer fever. The great nightmare had returned. Chapter 2: The Coward's Flight and the Blind Science. When the death toll began to climb in the blistering heat of June, the bravery of London's elite evaporated into thin air. At the first signs of a true epidemic, the people who were supposed to lead and protect the city simply packed their bags and ran away. King Charles II and his entire royal court fled to the safety of Oxford. Following closely behind were the judges, the wealthy merchants, the aristocrats, and, most devastatingly of all, the vast majority of the city's doctors. The roads leading out of London were choked with the gilded carriages of the rich, raising clouds of dust as they hurried away from the invisible slaughter. But what about the poor? What about the hundreds of thousands of tradesmen and laborers and their children? They were trapped. The surrounding villages, terrified of the contagion, formed armed militias and blockaded the roads. If you didn't have a certificate of health, which the poor could not afford, you were turned back at pitchfork point. London had become a massive quarantined prison. Those left behind in the suffocating, sweltering city turned to science for salvation. The problem was, 17th century science was completely and utterly blind. No one knew what a bacteria was. Instead, the greatest medical minds of the era believed in the theory of miasma, the idea that the disease was spread through corrupt, foul-smelling air. Their logic was tragically simple. London stinks, therefore the stink is killing us. If we destroy the bad smells, we destroy the plague. And so, the desperate and terrified went to war against the air itself. By order of the Lord Mayor, massive bonfires were lit in the middle of every street, burning day and night to purify the atmosphere. The city choked with thick black smoke. Men, women, and even young children were encouraged to smoke tobacco relentlessly. Others resorted to bizarre, desperate quackery, strapping dried toads to their chests or drinking concoctions made of powdered unicorn horn. None of it worked. The death toll skyrocketed. In a state of blind panic, the authorities looked for a scapegoat. They noticed that the disease seemed to spread faster in the dirty, cramped alleys teeming with stray animals. And so, the Lord Mayor issued one of the most disastrous decrees in the history of public health. He ordered the mass extermination of the city's cats and dogs. Bounty hunters roamed the streets. It is estimated that over 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were slaughtered and thrown into the already overflowing plague pits. It was a catastrophic mistake. By killing the cats and dogs, the authorities had wiped out the only natural predators the rats had. Without the felines to hunt them down, the black rat population exploded, and with the rats came the fleas. The very measure meant to save the city had essentially handed London over to the enemy on a silver platter. As the rats multiplied and the fleas feasted, the authorities resorted to their final and most brutal weapon, a law of quarantine so cruel it still shocks us today. If a single person in your household fell ill, if a father, a daughter, or a servant showed the black tumors on their neck, an examiner would report it. Within hours, city watchmen would arrive at your door. They would push you back inside, shut the heavy timber door, and nail it shut from the outside. You were locked in. The healthy trapped alongside the dying in cramped, suffocating rooms. On the outside of that sealed door, the watchman would paint a massive blood-red cross, and above it they would write a simple, haunting plea: "Lord, have mercy upon us." For the families trapped inside, there would be no mercy. They were simply left to wait for the death cart. Chapter 3: The Searchers and the Silent City. By September 1665, London was no longer a city of the living. It had become a waiting room for death. The deafening, chaotic noise of the great metropolis was completely gone. In its place hung a haunting, suffocating silence. The busy markets were abandoned. The taverns were boarded up. Grass actually began to grow up through the cobblestones in the middle of major thoroughfares like Whitehall. The only sounds that broke this terrifying quiet were the relentless tolling of the church bells and the heavy wooden wheels of the dead carts echoing through the empty alleys. "Bring out your dead!" That chilling cry rang out every single night. People would open their doors and simply carry out the bodies of their loved ones, placing them on the piled-high carts. But who decided who had actually died of the plague? Enter one of the most terrifying and tragic figures of the era, the Searchers of the Dead. These were not doctors. They were not medical professionals. The Searchers were usually elderly, impoverished women, often illiterate widows, who were paid a pitiful few pennies by the parish to perform a truly gruesome task. Whenever a death was reported, the Searchers were forced to enter the infected house. They would examine the fresh corpse, searching the neck, the armpits, and the groin for the telltale black buboes or the dark tokens of death. As they walked the deserted streets, these women carried white wands or red staffs, a physical warning for anyone still alive to stay far, far away from them. If the Searchers confirmed the plague, the house was immediately sealed, and the death was officially recorded in what became the most dreaded documents in England, the Bills of Mortality. These were weekly broadsheets, printed and sold across the city, keeping a horrific public scorecard of the Grim Reaper's harvest. Every week, the terrified citizens would buy these bills to see how fast the death toll was rising. And in the first week of September, the numbers shattered all comprehension. The official bill recorded an unimaginable 7,165 plague deaths in a single week. That was over 1,000 people dying every single day. But the terrifying truth? The real numbers were far, far worse. The parish clerks were completely overwhelmed. Many families bribed the Searchers to register the deaths as spotted fever or old age to avoid having their houses nailed shut. Modern historians estimate that the actual death toll during that peak week in September was likely double the official count. London simply ran out of space to bury its dead. The churchyards were physically overflowing, the ground raised several feet by the sheer volume of corpses. The authorities had no choice. They began digging massive, gaping trenches in the fields on the outskirts of the city, the infamous plague pits. At night, by the flickering, smoky light of torches, the dead carts would arrive. There were no funerals, there were no prayers. The bodies were tipped directly from the carts into these massive holes, stripped of their dignity, their names, and their shrouds, layered on top of one another like discarded timber until the pit was full. London was drowning in its own dead, and as the crisp winds of late autumn finally began to blow, the survivors could only ask one question: would anyone be left alive by Christmas? Chapter 4: The Frost and the Great Illusion. The salvation of London did not come from a doctor's bag. It did not come from the king's decrees, and it certainly didn't come from killing the city's cats and dogs. It came from the sky. In late autumn, the relentless, suffocating heat finally broke. November brought a biting, bone-chilling frost to the streets of London. And with that frost came a miracle that no one at the time truly understood. The death toll suddenly plummeted. Why? Because the true killer, the rat flea, cannot function in freezing temperatures. The bitter cold forced the insects into a dormant slumber. The biological time bomb had simply frozen over. By February 1666, the death rate had dropped so low that it was deemed safe enough for King Charles and his glittering court to return from their self-imposed exile. They rode back into a traumatized, hollowed-out city, acting as if the nightmare was merely a bad dream. The apocalyptic wave had finally crashed. But here is where history plays a massive trick on us. If you open almost any old textbook, it will tell you a very specific, neat little story. It will tell you that the plague was definitively wiped out in September 1666, when the Great Fire of London erupted in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The inferno swallowed 80% of the city proper. The popular myth claims that this apocalyptic fire acted as a giant, scorching purifier, incinerating the filthy timber houses, burning the rats alive, and boiling the plague out of existence. It is a perfect, dramatic ending. It makes for a great story, but it is completely false. The Great Fire did not stop the Great Plague. By the time the first sparks flew in Pudding Lane, the epidemic had already burned itself out months prior, suffocated by the winter freeze and the natural cycle of the disease. Furthermore, look at the map of the fire. The inferno destroyed the wealthy commercial center of the city. It barely touched the squalid, overcrowded suburban slums outside the city walls, places like St. Giles, Whitechapel, and Stepney. These were the very epicenters of the plague, the absolute capitals of the rat population. If the fire was the cure, the disease would have raged on in those untouched slums for years to come. But it didn't. The Great Fire didn't save the survivors of the plague. It simply burned down whatever little they had left. The echoes beneath the pavement. The Great Plague of 1665 was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in Britain. It wiped out an estimated 100,000 people. In just a matter of months, nearly a quarter of London's entire population was erased from existence. Today, London is a modern, gleaming metropolis of steel, concrete, and glass. But the past is never truly buried. Even now, when engineers dig deep beneath the streets to build new subway lines, their massive boring machines suddenly grind to a halt. They hit bone. They uncover the forgotten, massive plague pits of 1665. It is a silent, chilling reminder resting just feet below the rushing, oblivious commuters. A reminder of the year the poorest citizens were locked inside their own homes. The year the science was completely blind. And the year a microscopic monster brought an empire to its knees. Thank you for watching. If you want to uncover more dark truths hidden in the shadows of history, hit that subscribe button. See you in the next one.